So thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. This is part 2 of our For Us By Us or FUBU research webinar, how counselor educators are intentionally decolonizing research. So thank you again for coming to this Counselors for Social Justice sponsored event. We'll spend about an hour together with our wonderful panelists who we are so fortunate and lucky to have this afternoon. A couple of things I'm going to ask for all of you to, because this is a recorded webinar, I'll ask that you keep your microphones muted. There will always be time for us to have questions and answers, so feel free to use the chat to be in communication with one another, to respond to the things that our panelists are saying, and to hold some of those questions that you have. We'll make sure to have some time to open up for you all. Again, I guess I probably should introduce myself. I haven't done that. My name is Dr. Marlon Johnson, pronouns he, him. I am the Professional Development Chair for Counselors for Social Justice National. And I would love to introduce to you all our 3 panelists today, brought together by our research committee. So kudos to them as well for bringing these 3 voices and leaders together. I want to first present to you all Dr. Amanda Baden. So Dr. Baden is a transracial adoptee, adopted internationally from Hong Kong. She believes in examining issues of race, privilege, oppression, and power in adoption to promote ethical and sensitive practice with transracial adoptees and their families. Dr. Baden is a full professor at the doctoral program and the doctoral program director of the graduate counseling program at Montclair State University in New Jersey, as well as a licensed psychologist with a practice in New York City. She focuses her research and clinical practice on the adoption kinship network, transracial and international adoption issues, racial and cultural identity, and multicultural counseling competence. Dr. Baden was an editor of the Handbook of Adoption, Implications for Research, Practitioners, and Families. Dr. Baden also serves on the board on the New York State Board of Psychology, the advisory board for the Rudd Adoption Research Program at UMass Amherst, the board of Creating a Family, as senior fellow for the National Center on Adoption and Permanency, as chair of the Adoption Initiative biennial conferences held in New York City, and as a senior fellow for the former Donaldson Adoption Institute. Dr. Baden is an APA fellow for Division 17 of the American Psychological Association and was awarded the John D. Black Award in 2014 from APA and Division 17 for the outstanding practice of counseling psychology, outstanding graduate advisor for Montclair State University in 2017, and Angel in Adoption in 2005. So thank you so much, Dr. Baden, for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Next, I will introduce Dr. Christian Chan. Dr. Christian Chan is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Educational Development at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's also past president of the Association for Adult Development and Aging, and a proud queer person of color. As a scholar and activist, his interests revolve around intersectionality, effects of oppression and trauma, especially race-based trauma, on counseling, career and educational pathways, social justice and activism, and communication and socialization of cultural factors in couple, family, and group modalities. Dedicated to mentorship for leaders and scholars, he has actively contributed to over 75 peer-reviewed publications in journals, books, and edited volumes, and has conducted over 145 refereed presentations at the national, regional, and state levels. He currently serves as associate editor for Teaching and Supervision in Counseling. Everyone welcome Dr. Christian Chan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson and to SUNY. And it is so wonderful to join you all today. And thank you so much to the Counselors for Social Justice team as well.
Thank you. And of course, our wonderful third panelist for today is Dr. John Harry Chan. So Dr. Harry Chan is a Canadian of Chinese and East Indian ancestry, an immigrant to Canada and the son of immigrants, who was born and raised in Guyana, South America. He is a proud international faculty in the US and an assistant professor and co-advisor for the Sigma Alpha Chi chapter of CSI and the Department of Counseling at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Dr. Harry Chan's scholarship centers on counselor education leadership, development, and burnout, cross-cultural counseling and minority populations, like the LGBTQ+ population, immigrants, refugees, international students, and sex trafficked survivors, clinical supervision and gatekeeping, ethical and professional, as well as social justice advocacy, specifically using qualitative and quantitative methodologies. Two of Dr. Harry Chan's current research projects discuss the social determinants of health in relation to sex trafficked survivors in the US and the relationship between spirituality, stigma, stress, and resilience within the LGBTQ+ community. Dr. Harry Chan is passionate about creating access to affordable mental health services while advocating for minoritized and systematically excluded communities. He is actively involved in several professional counseling organizations, including ACA, ACES, ACERVIC, AARC, AMCD, AADA, CSJ, NBCC, KCREP, and CSI. Dr. Harry Chan is a recipient of the Chi Sigma Iota Journal of Counselor Leadership and Advocacy's Outstanding Article Award, the AMCD Young Emerging Leader Award, the AADA President's Outstanding Service Award, and the Texas Counseling Association's Professional Writing Award. On a side note, he enjoys watching Korean dramas, traveling, and sampling various ethnic foods, which will come in handy during our ACA conference in Toronto. So thank you, Dr. Harry Chan, for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and thank you to CSJ for the invitation to share space with all of you today.
My goodness. Y'all, we are so fortunate, and I am excited to learn from these scholars and to hear not only about the work that they've been doing, but to share with you all about how they've been doing this work to decolonize and disrupt the way that we engage in research inside of our field. So now that I've gotten through our introductions, I have a couple of questions that we want to ask you all from the CSJ perspective, but we're also going to welcome in questions from our audience. And the first one is, when were you first introduced to research, and how did that experience inform your researcher identity today? So when were you first introduced to research, and how did that experience inform your researcher identity today? And any of y'all can start.
I guess we're just looking at each other. Again, good afternoon, everyone. I'll share. I was introduced to research in my undergrad. I did my undergrad in Toronto at the University of Toronto at Scarborough. And I remember having a clinical psychologist, Mark Fournier, who did a lot of personality psych work. And so he really scared me about research initially. I told myself that I don't think that I could do it. I remember going to him and asking him if I could possibly work in his lab, and I got a hard no. and I was like, he takes only grad students, and I was an undergrad student at that point in time. And I was like, well, I guess really this isn't for me, and so I had this really disillusioned view, I guess, of the research process. I remember going into my master's program and having folks, it was very much teaching focused and clinical focused. And so being introduced to research, but not engaging in research, like doing it myself. And so it wasn't until I started my doc program at Liberty that I really got to, for the first time, engage in research. And very proud of my very first publication in a journal was in the Virginia Counselor's Journal as a doc student. And so that was significant for me because I was like, I don't think I can do this. I still many times would look at myself and I still don't think I can do this, but that's for another day. But just the fact of having someone take interest in developing my own identity as a scholar was very significant in helping me develop that identity that I didn't know I even had or possessed, kind of thing. And so, but that just really happened in my doc program. So not very long ago, and here we are kind of today.
Go ahead, Christian.
Yes, I was just going to say the funny story about research, right? So I actually was I did join a lab in an undergraduate research lab, or I was one of the undergrad students in the research lab, and it was actually on emotions and cognition. And I got so disenchanted with research that I did not actually think was going to be a career pursuit for me. And I had no intention of pursuing a doctoral program, PhD, and realized what had happened during that part of my life was it was because I couldn't really see the purpose, right? I wasn't connecting with the purpose of what I was doing, what I was researching. And I think it's also because it helps me actually think a lot about who I am as a researcher now. I also thought a lot about what kinds of relationships am I building with other colleagues and with the community. And I felt like that part wasn't quite solid in the lab. And I think, it was a really strong research lab. And I think if there was a connection to the topic, I would have had a very different perspective. And I think that was part of the reason, right? Like I didn't feel motivated by research that I didn't see an impact, particularly in terms of social change, and I didn't see an impact in what I would be doing. So I think that's where I got disconnected. And then I also thought a lot about what does research in relation mean, right? Like what is, when you think about how Amanda Tachin and also Z Nicolazzo really talk about this, it's the idea that, methodology can be in relation. And so when I think about relationships, that maybe that's the marker for what has really helped me understand myself as a researcher, and also what I've also really deemed as something that is a strong part of who we are, and what we get motivated, what we get excited about, where we find our heart in our research. And so for me, that has been more substantial in my journey at this point. But reflecting on that time, it's really funny to think about it that I had no interest in going into a doc program and no interest in doing research. And now it's a complete irony that I'm doing the reverse of that. So, but yes, so that's a little tidbit of the story.
Well, like both Christian and John, I also joined a research team when I was in my undergrad years at Penn State. And but I had, just to give context, I had started college as an architectural engineering major, and obviously didn't know what I wanted to do, and ended up falling into psychology and thought, well, let's try this IO psychology. So I ended up on a research team for a doc student, actually. And my role was to play a confederate of the study, where they would get, they were getting undergrad students to participate in this series where they were trying to teach me how to do put together some Tinker Toys essentially. And I was supposed to be very inept in my ability. And it was very interesting, you know, and they were looking to see how that person who was a manager would respond to my inability to put this thing together. And rather than, you know, so their study was about management, but I was really interested in the psychological aspects of how these different folks were responding to me in my pretend inability to do this. So from people doing things like ignoring me completely and not really caring whether I could put it together or not, to someone grabbing it out of my hands and putting it together themselves. And so I was really interested in that part, but that wasn't what the study was about. The study was about how, you know, a little bit about it, how management works, but not the inner workings of the way these people thought and how they responded to challenges. So, but I knew I didn't want to do IO psychology and ended up in counseling. Within my master's program, I was really got the great fortune to be mentored by Dr. Rosemary Phelps at University of Georgia. If you all know of her, she's wonderful. And so with her guidance, I decided to do a study on worldview because I thought worldview was really fascinating. Sorry, there's some chaos back here. So I conducted this study trying to find and meet people who were of different ethnic groups and look at worldview using Farah Ibrahim's measure at the time. It didn't go as I hoped. And I thought, I don't know if I can do this over the long term. This is not necessarily where I see myself. But with a multicultural counseling course that really inspired me to think about racial identity. And all of my work on adoption started after this, where I started thinking about whether those models fit for transracial adoptees or not. And my experience was they didn't. They missed a crucial part, which is really what inspired me to go on to get my PhD. Because I was interested in trying to understand what that was about, like how do we see this differently? And so I think although the undergrad experience did not really inspire me in terms of being the kind of researcher I ultimately became, I knew that I had lots of questions. I was curious, and so that actually really inspired me further down the road. So it was, but having mentors like Dr. Rosemary Phelps, Dr. Robbie Jean Stewart, who was my mentor at my doc program, where I was just really lucky along the way, and they really helped me start to ask the questions that I wanted to ask, not the ones that other people wanted to ask.
Dr. Baden, and all of y'all kind of shared some semblance of this. It's empowering to hear how each of you had these experiences very early in your education, your post-secondary education experiences in undergrad, on research teams, getting curious about a particular phenomena, and then finding yourselves realizing that the thing that people are asking you to study or the way in which the research is being done either got you interested in something else or you noticed something else. But one thing that sticks with me is that in each of your stories, you kind of said, I didn't feel like I was the person that could be conducting the next thing of research, or I wasn't sure if I belonged inside of that particular research space or that people would give me the chance. Dr. Baden, however, you said something I think that was a little bit different than the others, of acknowledging someone that affirmed your desire to want to move forward, to want to do your own study and your own research. And so I'm curious, for each of y'all, as you're kind of at different levels of your professional development, how has support kind of played a role in your own development as researchers and pursuing the particular topics that you're specializing in now? How, Dr. Baden, you kind of noted a couple of people, but I'm curious about others who may have even been in parallel spaces with you or in different fields that have supported and affirmed your work.
I know Dr. Baden and I are trading places here. So one of the pieces that I would say, you know, I think about the journey, right? And a major catalyst of how I got into research was not only doing research on a topic that felt important around multiculturalism and social justice, but it was a mentor in my master's program who graciously accepted me onto her research team. And I think that's right. Mentorship plays a huge part and ultimately became the catalyst for why I wanted to pursue the PhD and become a faculty member, become a counselor educator, because that is the difference that we can make, right? It isn't just about the transferring of knowledge or like experience, but it's also about really honoring, celebrating our mentees as colleagues, really celebrating our mentees in their self-efficacy and celebrating our mentees in their joy, their aspirations, their hopes, right? And I think that's what a mentor did for me. And that's, I think, what we can also walk away in terms of how we mentor in research, right? That's how we can mentor in relationship, in community, in research. The other piece that was also really crucial around support, right, was I think about support at the different stages of my career. And so support when I was going through my doc program, support when I was in my previous tenure track position at Idaho State, and support right now at UNCG. And for me, right, like it's also shaped my perspective on what I deem valuable in research, right? And that, you know, well, funny enough, like when people actually, the promotion and tenure guidelines are public for UNCG, both at the departmental and the School of Education levels. And actually there's an emphasis not necessarily on quantity, but on quality. And so when I thought about that, what the spirit of that message means to me, I actually really, you know, refuse this idea about like, maybe it isn't just about pushing out quantity and numbers, right? But really kind of trying to find a cohesive weave about what we care about in not only in our profession, but what we care about in the world, right? What we care about in society, what we care about in making change, right, in our communities. And so that's what I started to use as the driving force behind my work. And I said, you know, maybe it isn't just about just producing, right? It's about what is ultimately something I care about here. And what is something that I will remember at the end of the day of not just what I want to be known for, but I also, when I think about what do I want my relationships to look like at the end of this. And so that is what I've essentially used, right, to drive the force of my career. So that's the structural piece, right, of thinking about promotion and tenure guidelines, because we are all still navigating what in the world that means, right, in academia. The other piece that I will also say is, I think what was really enriching from a structural level is, you know, coming to UNCG, it's not only, you know, in our classification a minority serving institution, but it's also a community engaged institution. So the infrastructure is here, right? You can see that in our IRB procedures. You can see that in the ways that we have programming centered around community engaged research and ultimately being around scholars, right? Being in community with scholars where you're not the only one. That was really important to me, where I did not feel like I'm the only one doing this work, because that is a heavy lift. And I've also been in those places, right, where that was a heavy lift and I was the only one. And it's not just the fear that comes with that. It's also the fact that you know, the burden that I have to carry, right? And then having to go through this cognitive feud, essentially, of whether it's like, is this my battle to pick today? Or is this something that I have to let go for my own well-being, for my own integrity? And so is this the battle that I pick today? And so I think what is also really important, right, is knowing who your network, who your community is, not just within the profession, not just within society, but also really who's your community that, you know, is not only in your department, but also at your institutions. And I think that is that can be a really valuable force for what will motivate you, even when there are really, really hard days. And so that's what I think about in terms of support, right? Because when I think about the last piece I'll offer here is, you know, one of the ways that I saw that disparity, right, about being the only one was I mean, huge shout out to Dr. Arshad Ali and Dr. Lionel Howard, who, you know, at GW, they were a crucial part of my journey of deepening my work, particularly in critical methodologies. But when I saw that I was the only one doing that in certain places, in certain contexts, right? It's not, you know, it's like, it's not that I was like, okay, I'm afraid of doing this. It was the fact that I was doing it and then getting the friction, the pushback, the scrutiny, right? And I was like, okay, this is a lot. Like, and that's a heavy lift, right? Because that's so emotionally taxing. But to be in an institution, a community, right, where I'm not the only one doing that work, where there are several other scholars who are really deeply rooted in critical methodologies, that really also supported me, right? So I think about that, right? Like, know who your community is and who's going to sustain you at the end of the day, especially a really hard day.
Yeah, there's some power in what y'all are sharing, that there's a structural aspect to the support. Institutionally, you found yourself in a space that allowed you to not just look at how quickly or how often you were publishing to make the institution or the space notable, but your colleagues, your community was actually inviting you to study things in a way that was innovative and novel, in a way that was that helped you to differentiate the literature in new and exciting ways. You really felt encouraged to find your way forward as an academic versus trying to prove that you could fit the mold of what research was supposed to look like within your particular content area of interest. Yeah.
Just to add to what Dr. Chan said, I would say I look at Dr. Chan as a mentor in the field. I've been able to collaborate with him and just learn from him. And there's so many people on our Zoom that are here that have just been such tremendous influences, positive influences in my life in terms of collaboration and learning. I think it's also important to acknowledge that beginning that process is daunting. You know, beginning that process as someone that had very little capital, networking capital, you know, community cultural wealth capital. I think it was daunting for me coming into that space. And thankfully, there are people who care enough to have taken me in and invited me into that community space. But I know that the process of getting there was a challenge for me. I saw that as a challenge, you know, and so there are probably people on the call who might be in that space of saying, I don't know who to go to, and knowing that it might take that you might have those closed doors, you know, encountering closed doors of saying, hey, I can't do this right now. And I think that's the challenge, depending on where we're folks being fortunate to be at, like Dr. Chan being at UNCG, where there is that support. There might be institutions where that isn't the case, and we have to work and earn and live, you know, those realities. And it's okay if you're there and you're having that message come down that you have to probably publish, or, you know, I think what then happens is that you intentionally seek to find folks who can then feed you, as opposed to further diminish you in those spaces, right? And I think that's been an important piece for my own sort of movement into higher education and the research process. So, and I've been, again, fortunate to just learn. And I think just having that mentality of going into a relationship with the intent of learning and growing has been very much, I would say, a blessing in and of itself in helping me develop as a researcher.
I'll just say briefly that, I think to me, I love what Dr. Chan and Dr. Harry Chan said about this finding people, looking for the people who are going to be there for you. And for me, growing up as a transracial adoptee who was surrounded by whiteness, much of my life, finding these mentors who were people of color who had gone before me and who could help me figure out how to manage, because I don't think I had a Black professor till graduate school, and or teacher of any kind, and then Asian professors, none in graduate school actually. So it was something that I was realizing that maybe I wasn't going to find much in this field. But then, because what I do as an adoption isn't done that much in counseling, isn't done that much in psychology, it's an interdisciplinary field. And so a lot of the mentors that I found were not necessarily ones through the different professional organizations, but through our shared interest. And but again, they were the few faculty of color that I could find who were helping me get my voice and feel like I could do something that wasn't necessarily sanctioned that well. The idea of insider research was something that a lot of folks still, I think, question the validity of and the ability to do it ethically. And my response over the years has been that I can understand why they would have concerns that my agenda, my experience would be what I was trying to present as a finding, for example. But I think the real benefit is that I ask questions because of my experience, because of my clinical practice with adoptees almost exclusively, that other people might not ask, and that they might not see or hear because they aren't in those spaces in the same way. They might observe the spaces, but they don't live them. And so when you live them, you might be able to ask a question that other people might not. So I see that as the value of, and that's the way, like when I was in graduate school, there's no one talked about decolonizing anything. This was back in the 90s. But I didn't think I was doing that, but it turns out maybe that's what some of my work ultimately was able to, for me at least, and for some other folks who have found a sort of space now for adoption research in our field. I see that Dr. Susan Branco's on this Zoom, and she's another person one of my friends and colleagues who's doing this kind of work as well.
Come on with naming all the good people in the room. I love it. I love to hear it. Yes. So what I'm enjoying is to hear how mentorship and collaborative initiation, I'm gonna go ahead and coin that term, helped you all to keep motivating, keep moving forward, keep saying that your work is valid, your research is valid, even if the institution doesn't quite understand the framework that you're working from. So let's keep digging into this structural talk that we're having right here, because part of being able to engage in this work and to do this research is in some ways a hope that we'll be able to publish this work and to disrupt what we're seeing in the milieu of research in the here and now. So what has been your experience of publishing research that intentionally decolonizes academia? And if at all, what challenges have you faced when engaging in research that is focused specifically on decolonizing counseling?
I mean, I'll go first. I think that I don't know that my work has fully decolonized counseling as much as just questioned things. And, maybe that's part of it, but Suni Sharma, who's also on this Zoom, can reflect on an experience we recently had where we submitted a manuscript, and the work was on adoption and racial microaggressions that white adoptive parents were committing within their families to their children of color that they had adopted. And one of the things we experienced in that process was a ton of pushback and a ton of discomfort with the idea that we were floating through this, and that we had, data to show. So it was the most blatant example in my publishing career of a journal that really was pushing back against that, and where clearly the reviewer was unhappy with what we were doing. So I think of that, but then I also, in my first academic job, I was encouraged to not do my research on adoption, but to instead do work on counseling in New York City public schools, because I was working in New York City at a university here. And I thought I was stunned by it, really, because I thought we had academic freedom. I thought you knew this is what I did when you hired me, this kind of thing. But it was significant to me because I went to my mentors and said, what do I do about this? How do I make my case for what I'm doing when I'm being told this is what they need me to do? They helped me, and what I ultimately did to manage it was to leave. So and find a place that would support whatever I wanted to do. But that process, when you start to see it in the institutions, in the structural part of our field, it's disappointing. And one of the things, now that I've been in the field for quite a long time, I try and really try and pay it forward to sort of tell people when they come to Montclair and say, well, what do you like about this? And I said, I've got nothing but support for the kind of research I want to do. And no one's telling me I'm supposed to produce a certain kind of research, which doesn't sound like that should be a big deal, but it kind of is, I guess. So, thanks.
I appreciate what Dr. Baden shared about, what does it really mean when we embody what decolonizing research really means, right? And that definition, because are we talking, right? And the question I often pose among colleagues, among community, is whether we are talking about decolonizing or are we actually doing it? And so, and I pose that question, right, for a particular reason, because I pose the question because it's about how do we invoke our responsibility in terms of what we do in research. And I think maybe if we start there first, that changes our whole perspective, right? When we see ourselves as somebody who is responsible and answerable to the communities that we're serving. And I think that tends to shift our whole ethic around research. And so when I think about decolonizing research and what we responsibly define or identify or use, I also think a lot about, that decolonization, right, has a lot to do with, really understanding which strands we're really attending to, right? Because there's a difference between anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, and decolonialism. And so I also encourage everybody to really, deepen ourselves in understanding what that really means and what definitions we're using, what principles we're using to really augment decolonization. So when I think about this, right, I think there are a few places where I think about what does this mean for me, right, in terms of decolonizing research. I think one of the places is that first, I tend to push back against all the, I'm gonna label it the fetish, right, that we have in our profession, the fetish around basically the objective, right? Basically it's well, this research only counts if you have this such and such sample size in qualitative research. And I say to hell with all that. Because part of this, right, it's funny, and the other fetish too is around impact factor. Your research can only be valid if it's only on this 8.5 impact factor journal. And I'm always like, hold up. So funny enough, there are some counseling journals, there are some psychology journals that don't actually have an impact factor. And there are qual research journals that are publishing sample sizes of 1 and 2. But here's the catch, right? It's because what did you do with your participants? What did you do with your participants? It isn't just about, oh, well, I sent them like this thing of like their whole transcript and called it a day. And I was like, okay, so where they at, like, but also, and I also interviewed them for 15 minutes. I was like, okay, so tell me what that means, right? Like, and how we are not just treating this as a transaction, right? Or extraction of data, right, from participants. So, and that's the other key, right? In terms of decolonizing research, how do we really point or strategize our whole research design around what is not just going to be a transaction with participants? What is not just going to be an extraction? And maybe if we start there, that might change the way that we even perceive how, like, what is valuable to us and what is valuable to the community. And so I think in that vein of what that might look like in terms of decolonizing research. The other piece I'll also identify is, so there are a lot of times, and I think Dr. Baden and Dr. Harachand also made some points about this, right? That, we're running into, editorial boards that really will put limits on how we actually can share the research, right? And it's, for me, it's interesting how there are some reviewers, some editorial board members, and I can see this right from the other side of, as being an associate editor, that sometimes what happens is that we're going through a really problematic issue where there are people who are assigned who actually have no clue what the research is about. So that's a real problem too, right? Where people are randomly assigning. And so this is where I really call upon editors, right? And editorial leaders to really know, you have to be really intentional with who you're assigning your manuscripts to, because if you're not responsibly doing that, this is the kind of harm that can exist. And this is how we participate in epistemic exclusion, right? This is exactly how we foreclose representation of authors in our journals. So, and also, I think about this too, where I think in a lot of ways, it's also about the way we give feedback, right? So I've made it a point, not only in my own personal practice, but also in the practice of really also instructing what reviewers should be doing, is also to make sure, okay, so nobody here needs to be reviewer two, right? Like what we see is proverbial reviewer two. Like no one here needs that. No one needs that kind of drama. We all have drama in our lives already, right? Like academia is full of drama. Nobody needs any of this. So I will say this, this is where we have the opportunity to instruct our reviewers, our editorial board members to be better and do better, right? And so, because what some people do is they decide, oh, they give such scathing feedback. And I'm like, you don't realize who's on the other side of that. You don't realize that the people who are ultimately, right, doing work, particularly around social justice, around multiculturalism, that these are scholars who have lived experiences, right, attached to that. And this is exactly how we replicate the whole system of trauma, right? It's that's exactly what we're doing if we give really problematic scathing feedback. And I think a lot of it, right, I know we've all heard horror stories around people who are just projecting, right, their white supremacy, their whiteness, unknowingly. And it's it's exactly what's showing up. And so I'm going on a diatribe here. So, but I will go ahead and pause for now.
Thank you, Dr. Chan. I mean, what I wrote down was research for us is, I would say, and not to necessarily speak for Dr. Baden and Dr. Chan, I think research is resistance for us, or it has become resistance for us. And that is powerful in the sense that we get to be in spaces that are so sacred and valuable to who we are. And we get to interact with people who are willing to share those experiences with us so that we then can share that out to our communities. And I think when we look at it from the perspective of, there's the challenge of we write as researchers, and many times there is very little in terms of, apart from getting a publication, right? With that, it's no other sort of fame that comes with it, sort of thing. You're not getting paid for that service. You're supporting the journal maybe, in terms of funding or whatnot. But then I think I have now started looking at who gets to receive this information, how accessible is this information, and am I going back into the community where that information was extracted to then continue building on it, right? And so if we don't have that view, I think it's just, again, we're perpetuating that same sort of let me plunder and not provide, and I think that's an important thing for me when it comes to engaging in research now that I probably didn't have initially, coming into this space. And I think that's because I was just taught that, just go get the work done. And once it's done, you wrap it up and you kind of like ship out sort of thing. And so that's been helpful in terms of how do I show up and be genuine and authentic in that space, honoring the people that I get to work with, and then being able to maintain or sustain the relationship even after the fact that it's been done, And so right now, like my colleagues and we're planning to do a research trip we have a partnership in Oaxaca, Mexico, with the community there. And so this summer and this has been over 5 years of building the relationship. And so we're finally moving into space of doing research with these communities there and looking at just their traditional practices when it comes to well-being. And they've just been so much informed by Western ideals of well-being. And they're noticing in the communities that it's just not working, and I'm like, has anyone thought of asking them what they do and how they use their practices to help them? And I'm like, no. And so that I was like, well, why haven't we done that, right? And how do we not? Why? It's like we've not honored their story, their narrative. Instead, we've chose to impose on their narrative, and so that's been something that I've been much more attuned to, and in trying intentionally to break down in my own mind, first, and then hopefully trying to do so in the relationships that I get to be a part of. So yeah, thank you.
I was also, in tandem with what Dr. Harchand was talking about, one of the key points for all of us, both in qualitative and quantitative research, right, is that we need to know who we are as a researcher, and we need to know the social identities that we show up in the world, right, in our research, right, because that changes the way that we engage in relationships with co-researchers, with research teams, with participants, right, that I think about it this way, right, where I remembered reading over someone's interview protocol, and one of the key issues that I saw was like, so wait, you're jumping into the first question like this? I mean, here's what's going to happen. Your participant might think, this is how I need to kind of create the response, right, because this is what you're asking me to do, and you're still imposing a lot of power in that relationship as a researcher. And then the other piece too is like, they haven't gotten a sense to know you and why you care about this research. Maybe the interview protocol needs to start with an introduction about who you are, not just like, hey, I'm this assistant professor at such and such institution, but it's also about, hey, here's why I care about this research. Hey, here's who I am, right? Like I'm and what social identities I carry. And so I just want you to know that this is meant to be a conversation. This isn't meant to be about me interrogating you, right? And so in that vein too, and I will say that transfers also to quantitative research, right? Because a lot of people obsess over data and not the actual research process itself, because you can do you can still engage, right? Even though like, yes, you're really thinking about measures, right? but also again, like being very careful in curating what measures you're going to use, right? Whether measures, the language in those measures can be really harmful, can be stereotypical, can really be problematic, right? The other piece too is how are you even administering, right, the measure itself? And is it more, would it be more valuable in person, right? Would it be more helpful in providing instructions that really care and affirm participants? And so, you know, it's not to say that that kind of positionality and reflexivity go away when you do quant research. And I am very much a strong advocate for people writing positionality statements, not just, you know, here are my social identities, right? But here are my biases, my perspectives on the study, right? Also in quant research, but, you know, that's a battle that I will continue fighting, and it may not be only today. So, yes.
The way in which y'all all invite your research to not just be about taking information from communities, but to be living almost historical aspects of giving voice to communities and allowing communities to train and teach us about the work that we're doing, not only in mental health care, but in collaboration and community care. That necessity really speaks to the way in which I'm hoping we are pulling away from just the structure of what research should or could be about. You're really intentional about saying our research is just telling the story of, you know, the numbers or the information or the surveys that we're doing with these communities. It's much more than just the numbers. It's living truths that we're continuing to have in a conversation about with the communities that we serve and that serve us and that work alongside us inside of this work. So I know we have a couple of minutes left, and we have some community members who also want to offer some questions. I'll invite you all to both share in the chat, but also to send them if you want to be bold and unmute as well. I think I have one from our current CSJ president.
Thank you. First of all, hey friends, hey y'all. Couple comments before I ask my two questions. Oaxaca is beautiful, so if you want me to go as like a research assistant, I will go with you, John. Dr. Harachan, yes to everything that's been said. Hey, Christian. I have a gripe with Dr. Baden because she's mentioning all these names and she didn't mention mine, but we'll talk about that later on. My two questions is, I found that a lot of folks of color kind of break through and reach the upper echelons of the profession and tend to start internalizing the oppressive practices that permeate the space. And so I want to know if you feel like you have fallen maybe victim to that, how you pushed against it, or how do you not fall victim to that? Because it tends to be that professors of color are harder on students of color, which, you know, perpetuates. But anyway, so if you could speak to that. And then also, the revise and resubmit and reviewer process can be very, as you all were saying, harsh, and can kind of beat you down. What keeps you going? What keeps you doing it? And y'all not gonna be quiet on me. So Christian, then Dr. Baden, and okay, John first, go.
I would just, I think that maybe the second question that you said about the difficult or the challenge, right? The emotional turmoil that it takes from the revision process. I think doing it in community. You know, I've been fortunate to have good folks that I've partnered with in research to just say, hey, we have this, and rather than me just being the one taking it on and say, I'll go through the revision, we'll do this together, you know, and yes, we'll gripe about the fact that why are they asking this question? I thought I talked about it in the methodology itself, you know, sort of thing. And that has been helpful. And sometimes I might have this really negative view going into the process, and it's not until I meet with the other persons on the team, and they're like, "Hey, well, did you think of this?" You know, and then having to shift my view, because again, I'm happy to admit I do not know everything, you know, and I never will. So I think that's been helpful from the community side. In terms of perpetuating that which we have also maybe experienced, I think it might look like that Possibly. I hope I don't fall into that category. I try to keep myself in spaces or around people that help ground me in that space, hopefully, and that's been helpful for me. At the same time, I think the reality, I've had folks reach out to me to ask for assistance in collaborating, and I think the challenge there is that being where I am now, where a research institution, an R1 institution, having doc students that now I'm responsible for, they become my primary responsibility. And for me to then tell them, no, it's hard for me to say, I can't help you right now. I think what I would recommend is, if I can't help you right now, is potentially putting you in connection with someone else who might be out there, right? And don't see that as me being as rejecting you. It's just simply the fact of where I am currently in my space, right? And so I think that's a recognition that I don't necessarily communicate that to folks, but I think that that's how it might be perceived, that, oh, I might have gotten someplace and I'm not necessarily helping the other person. I'm trying to help the folk. Or the other part is that being in mentorship programs that I've been a part of is that I am then actively engaging those folks in that process, and to take on another person into that space, that's an emotionally labor-intensive process. And I think it's not that I go about saying, oh, I have 10 students or something that I'm mentoring already, or people that are in the academy, and you're now asking me to be the 11th person. I'm not going to say that. I think that, but that's just the nature of the beast that we're up against. But not to be discouraged by it. And it's like, I remember Dr. Butler said this as to, you may get a no, but that might be simply where someone is saying they're not able to do it right now. Find the person who is, So, and I think that's just something that I've taken with me into my spaces.
I know we're right at time, so I want to just inquire from you all as our panelists. Are you okay with having a couple more minutes? And those of y'all who are also participants, if that's okay. Wonderful.
I have to run in a minute because I have a research team meeting that's happening right now without one. So, but I'm just in response. First of all, Dr. White and I have collaborated many times. So I am mentioning her name with purpose, and she was also involved in the microaggressive responses from that reviewer. And it was actually really great to be able to talk with both all of my co-authors on that and say, I'm hearing this when I read this. What are you guys hearing? Because maybe I'm very sensitive to this. Maybe I'm misreading it or something like that. But I got very strong responses from Dr. White and from SUNY about like, okay, no, this is definitely microaggressive. There's a lot of white fragility in these responses. We have to really look at this. But in terms of what Dr. Harichan was saying, I was just thinking about the young adoptee scholars, people who are going into grad school, who are trying to start their careers, or they're doing their dissertations, and they want someone who's been out there for a long time ask me to be on their committee or do something like that. I always, as you were saying, Dr. Harichan, like we do have so many different responsibilities, but I also always want to support adoptee scholars who are, there aren't a lot of us. There are more now than there ever were, but I feel like some obligation always to do that. And so it's a hard thing. And now that I, of course, know a few others, sometimes I can send them to them as well. But it's certainly, I want to pay forward what I got from my mentors too, and I know that we all feel that obligation. But and what Dr. Chan was saying, I really agree with the positionality statements that I actually was on a whole panel about this with folks who were in the adoption constellation, but who believed that didn't affect their research in any way. And so that it wasn't necessary to say anything about it. And So we had a whole debate about it because it was interesting that, and depending on which part of the adoption constellation you're in, there's different questions about people's motivations and their objectivity and their fairness in general. So that's all I can say. But thank you so much to everyone for inviting me. I'm sorry I have to leave, but it was wonderful meeting all of you, and thank you again.
So how about we take the time to go ahead and pause our time and our space together. You all have been wonderful panelists. I wish I could say that before Dr. Baden was able or needed to sign off. But can we go ahead and give some reactions, some celebrations to our three panelists and the work that they've done to just share some of their knowledge, some of their richness to all of us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I saw that there was one question that went unanswered, and I will take note of this question because I think it will be really helpful for us to think about how we continue this work of engaging and doing active community engagement as an aspect of our research, especially with populations that see research as time-intensive, laborious, and maybe even having no particular support for the work that they're doing in their community spaces. So I'm taking note of that question. PD is on it, okay? So again, thank you all. I have put the survey inside of our chat, but if you need the link one more time, I will place it here. Oh my, maybe I won't place it there. Here we are. So on behalf of Counselors for Social Justice, the Professional Development Committee, and the Research Committee, thank you all for your time and your energy. Again, thank you for our panelists for the time and the experience and the expertise that you have shared. And for all of y'all on the call who have been mentors, leaders, scholars, and disruptors in our field, we are so grateful and glad to have you here. Please keep doing your work, and please keep being the light for both mental wellness and for the communities in which you live and embody. Just so you all are aware, we are still on a roll with several webinars. We have another one coming up on March 24th. That will be with Dr. Frank Goritz Fitzsimmons and Dr. Lily Burciaga, and they will be talking about addressing elements of white supremacy in counselor education, providing us with a model, a curriculum model for decentering whiteness. So be on the lookout for more information on how to register for that event. But for now, thank you all for your time. Enjoy your weekend, and for some of you, the beginning or the end of your spring breaks. So thank you again for all of your time, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.